Okay, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tips.
My turn.
You're on.
Kim Jong-un is my new best friend. Thank you very much.
Sound okay?
Are we okay? Yeah. Sound wise.
Can you hear me okay, Bob?
I can hear you
A
loud.
little closer to your mic.
Okay.
Swallow it.
Let me clamp it down a little bit.
Swallow it.
And start your show.
Hello, everybody. It's another edition of Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions. And today our topic is going to be something that's happened in the last week or so, and we're talking about the G7 meeting, and also going to talk about the Singapore summit between President Trump and our friend Kim Jong-un. So, but I want to introduce to you somebody that's new to the TIPS program, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Norman Chip McCleod, who's also the Department Chair of History and Political Science here at Dixie State University. Welcome, Chip.
Hey, Bob. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm going to be picking your brain today. Okay, we want your positions on this because there's a lot going on. So what I want to do is I'd like to start off with the sequence here. We've got a meeting between the G7 countries on June 8th and 9th in Quebec. And then I'd like to follow up and ask you a few questions about your positions and impressions as to what transpired at the Singapore summit on June 12th between President Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Well, we will see where that takes us.
All right, fantastic. So here we go. We go back to the summit. We're at Quebec. We have the G7 countries being represented. We've got Canada, France, we've got the EU, and the Italian new prime minister from Italy all coming together, and President Trump. And he's got a big meeting coming up in the summit in Singapore just after this G7 conference. And so my question to you is, going into the meeting, President Trump has announced that there's going to be tariffs across the board, and these are our allies on the G7. And so it's really a testy type situation walking into this. I guess my first question to you is, based on what President Trump's telling the American people and the world, that these tariffs will not be harmful, can you elaborate on that and tell me what you think? Are they going to be harmful to us?
Well, it depends on any number of things, of course, Bob. When President Trump, not too long ago, suggested to the American people and, of course, others in the world that trade wars are easy. We can win trade wars. That underpins his assertion that he's been hammering away at for quite some time now, that our trade agreements with countries all over the world are just patently unfair to us, which means we need to revamp them. We need to recalculate them, recalibrate them a little bit so as to even them up. He seems to think, and not that many people in the real world of economics agree with him, he seems to think that we can sort of push a button given our incredible economic clout in the world, and I'm guessing at this a little bit, but that ultimately these countries will have no choice but to go along. He seems to think that will function. He doesn't give much voice to any serious fallout, and that leads us to any number of questions about how real trade barriers and wars have affected economies for a long time. Trade wars are bad. That may seem like an oversimplified response in part, but you don't want trade wars. And in fact, I've been following some of the historical literature, of course, and I read some interesting things this week. And there was a fun little article in one of the newspapers that offered two words to trade wars and barriers and whatnot, and the two words were Great Depression.
Mhm.
So I'm not suggesting that he's going to cause some sort of worldwide economic downturn necessarily, but he seems very confident that we can push these people, make them sit up, take notice, change their economic behavior, and I'll go ahead and toss this in, the idea that some sort of trade deficit is automatically a bad thing. Many people disagree with that.
Good. Well, we'll have to wait and see, as they say. But as this G7 meeting progressed, a couple of interesting things happened. One is that when the meeting was already had started, President Trump was not there, and all of a sudden he walks in. Was that? What do you think? Was that intentional, or?
Well, the disclaimer that I'll offer as I talk about Donald Trump's behavior is that I think it's fun sometimes, and I have no training in mental health as a professional, but it really taxes our ability to figure out who this man is, certainly in terms of his behavior, on any given day. The notion has been floated that he wanted to command some sort of attention by showing up late, and you were probably going to ask about this as well, and by leaving early.
Yes.
What is that? He's throwing his weight around as the U.S. president. He is exhibiting his lack of serious interest in what our greatest allies on the planet are discussing and need to take very seriously. And he talked about how basically we've got this in the U.S., plus I have a little summit to prepare for and what have you. And really, I'm not sure what message he was trying to send by that behavior. I'm sure he has all kinds of clocks, watches, and people to get him where he's supposed to be on time. But I can't help but think, sort of a parting shot for this little element, I can't help but think that it was intentional.
Well, it's hearsay. It's hearsay. I don't know.
Yeah, nor do I. It looked like one of those the Trumpian moves to me, but I have no definitive info on that.
I've got one more before we leave the G7. He initially came out and said, "Why don't we re-invite Russia and make it the G8 like it was?"
Right.
Referring to they being ejected in 2014 for their annexation of Crimea, and that was a world saying, this particular group saying you can't do that. And now he's saying, I want Russia back on board. Why would he want that?
Well, you can run down the short list of Russian infractions that people argue got them kicked out of this elite group of economies on the planet Earth, whether it's the Crimea, Ukraine. They're clearly going after agents in foreign countries and killing them. One of the great moments in our history will be one of these days what we finally make of what the Russians were clearly up to in our presidential election in 2016. That did not shed a particularly favorable light on them. In partial answer to your question, though, it isn't clear that Donald Trump cares about or understands the post-World War II world of alliances in the same way that our other chief executives and heads of state have understood those things. In fact, it seems to me that anybody, any nation, state, or what have you, that threatens in his mind, the way he parses this, the well-being of this country ought to be suspicious to some extent as well, hence a partial explanation of why he's behaving toward the other members of the G7 the way he was. I have to toss in the notion that one day, I trust, we'll figure out what his connection. Seems to me there must be one to Russia somewhere, somehow. And perhaps if it's not simply self-serving, a kind of a twofer, Donald Trump plus the nation, however he sees a big potential player like Russia affecting things if Russia comes back into the fold. But you also have to consider the fact that it's not clear to me that somehow, some way, Donald Trump sees Russia as that bad.
Yeah, it's interesting the way he keeps bringing that up, and every time there's a criticism of Russia, he defends that country.
Well, and maybe there must be someone out there who understands what he thinks about these things. I don't know that he talks to anyone about it, or that it's clearly articulated, or that he has any systematic method for thinking about anything. I wouldn't want to oversimplify this simply to say that he has something going on. There are deals or whatnot that he wants to preserve and continue and that sort of thing, because we don't know that. It stands to reason, but Russia is a very powerful piece of that part of the world. And then there's what to me is just a little potentially comical, if you will, in that I don't know whether this will come. It probably will when we start talking about the summit, but his fondness for the tough guy, authoritarian leaders in the world is just fascinating.
Amazing. Okay, we're now it's June the 8th is over with at the G7. Now it's the morning of Saturday, June the 9th, and Donald Trump's going to leave early. He gets on Air Force One, and he's on his way now to Singapore, leaving the G7 with some tentative agreements on some minor issues. And he views a broadcast on Air Force One that shows that Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister from Canada, is saying that we've all have an agreement on this. And he said, I don't remember agreeing on that. So he sends a Twitter or something back to the G7 saying, forget it, we're not signing anything, we being the United States.
Right.
So this is en route. So again, he even in the air between Quebec and Singapore, he wants control, and he doesn't like to have people tell him, hey, we made this agreement. No, we didn't. So he withdrew from that. So we're landing in Singapore. Okay, so now we're at the summit, and we're ready for them to arrive, and Kim Jong-un is coming in, and he arrives in a Boeing 747 owned by the People's Republic of China.
Yes, he did.
Yep.
Wasn't that an interesting entree for him?
Yeah, and it was interesting that when they finally got together, there was a 13-second handshake for the cameras, and both smiling. So that's a good thing. But here's what came out so far. I'm fast forwarding here.
Sure.
The U.S. concession, suspension of joint military exercises with South Korea. And then they show them coming in, and they both sign this document with no details. Okay. Denuclearization is achieved, according to President Trump. Your feelings and positions on that?
Well, they wrote it down anyway. Not to diminish the potential that this meeting might have for some momentous changes in the world, and I'm saying that because what I took from this was, among other things, what we have here is an amazingly well orchestrated and produced diplomatic dog and pony show. Everybody has his or her own little film snippets. I don't know whether we'll come back to this or not, but the North Korean media waited 2 days after the summit and then produced a just very well done, I believe it was a 42-minute film, their version of what took place here. But on the face of it, what we have is something that that Trump is milking, and as well he should. He's the only president to do this.
That's right.
I mean, it was just the other day when the little rocket man and old Goddard were going at it. And one of the first things that the North Korean media did was to just wipe away all of those insults and whatnot. And there was a big to-do made of the fact that they continually referred to Trump as President Donald Trump, very, respectful.
Put a positive spin on it.
Yes,
they?
put a politics on a national stage where we're duking it out politically one day, and then next week all is forgotten. But one of the things you mentioned was, yes, in this pretty fuzzy document is a call for the complete and total denuclearization of North Korea. I am among the billions of people all over the planet who I don't know what that means. There's nothing in the way of a timetable. Nothing has been mentioned so far as I know, at least up to this particular moment, about how that will be accomplished. Trump was very, very solicitous of the film footage the North Koreans shown, that they were showing all over the place, depicting their blowing up whatever facility that was.
That was the one I think that they invited our film crews from around the world, but they kept them at bay.
Well, again, Donald Trump's response to that was that he thought it was the real thing, not some fake site or something, and that they could do once again for international diplomatic and publicity purposes. And he also has something else that springs to mind. Responded to this immediately because everybody was interviewing him. The plane couldn't even take off. They had news folks on the airplane. He was trying to get out of there, and they delayed the flight so he could talk to some people. But this idea that he's looking very much forward to this, and his go-to response to serious questions that he can't answer because he logically doesn't have the information required, and even things that I'd argue he probably ought to know but doesn't, is we'll see. We'll see. And he was being quizzed on what if this happens, this doesn't happen, you name it, what are you going to do, and we'll see. In fact, it was either today or late yesterday that he was touting this agreement with Kim Jong-un having to do with bringing back the remains of fallen soldiers from the Korean War. He insists they've already started the process. That's what he said. And I don't know whether we'll elaborate on this, but it is of keen interest to me, and I imagine most people as well, the way Trump prefers to do diplomacy, and I think you got a really good example of his approach when everybody heard him say, watched him on TV, I don't need to prepare for this.
That's right.
It's about attitude. In fact, then he came back and sort of supported that notion with the idea that I've been preparing for this for my entire life. And the other thing that springs to mind in terms of the production value of this, again, not to diminish what could happen. He did something but nobody else has done. I mean, since the end of the Korean War.
That's right.
He was even commenting as he watched film of the North Korean military might on the beaches and whatnot, and he's already bringing up the notice. What a nice area for a condo and some vacation space. And the other thing that I, as an historian, I have to bring this up. He sounded so much to me like Lyndon Johnson in 1965 offering Ho Chi Minh a North Vietnamese version of the Great Society. Quit invading South Vietnam, quit messing around with these people's ostensibly free nation and whatnot, and we will give you $1 billion, and your people will be so much healthier and happier and better off. Vietnam will remain divided, but and of course also unlike Donald Trump, like him but unlike him as well. Johnson, who was a serious political deal maker,
yes,
one of the best, very much wanted to sit down with Ho Chi Minh. That never happened. But Donald Trump, he did this. He's talking to this guy, and we will be trying to figure this out and evaluate it for some time to come. And the other thing, again, that springs to mind is that you've got people really pushing, nudging for something clear and definable to have happened with this, at least by the end of Trump's first term.
Well, the big question that I'm hearing over the last few days is you already brought up about the timetable. There's no timetable, but the enforcement. Once there is a tentative agreement, how do you enforce that? Because North Korea has tunnels and caves, and I mean, that's what they do. And he inherited that from his father and grandfather. This is the way they ran that country. So how are you going to ever, I'm thinking back to Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction. How are you ever going to identify all of those areas and spaces and verify that they indeed have been denuclearized?
That is going to be tough. That is something that will have to be negotiated clearly. And it also connects with Trump's confidence that he listened to all the incredibly pleasant things he had to say about the leader of North Korea after this, praising him on several venues I saw for being a tough guy. This guy, and people keep just pelting the president with these objective facts of life in North Korea. I mean,
human rights violations.
He's a ruthless, authoritarian killer, and I mean of his own people,
of his own family.
Of his own family. The people are starving there in order that North Korea maintain one of the largest militaries on the planet Earth, and Trump does his usual Trumpian job of deflecting and sending the conversation somewhere else, if you will. And at the end of the day, maybe I don't know. A lot of people would certainly disagree with this, and probably violently. But for the time being, maybe he should tread lightly on that. He just got the guy to sit down, and so maybe this is not exactly the right time. The people in the State Department have to figure that out. But he's constantly offering what sounds like praise to me of whether it's Putin or Kim Jong-un or Duarte, or whoever you want to talk about. And there's something about those people, and equally important, I think it's quite intriguing, the extent to which he really seems to believe that within 2 hours he's forged a close personal relationship with these people that he intends to use to great benefit. It's a great story the way he tells it, and the again, we could go on all day, but I'd have to get this out. The way that both sides, of course, they had to spin it, and one of the most important things the North Koreans did was to sell the idea that these two men met in this summit as absolute international equals.
And that's what he was after.
And he got that. Kim got that.
Yes.
And Trump, he had nothing to say about it. So, I mean,
moving forward.
Yes.
Listen, I'm going to throw one at you now.
Okay.
We've talked about the G7. We've talked about the summit, but one country is really benefiting from all of this, and it's going to be China. Because if you think about it, China over the years has been nervous about the uncertainty of North Korea and the development of nuclear weapons, number one. Number two, they didn't like, because of those military exercises between the
Right.
United States and South Korea. They didn't feel comfortable with that.
Sure.
So, based on what we've talked about, the military, the joint military operations have been ceased. According to the Pentagon, they don't know anything about it, but that's okay. They said they'll.
Well, I don't think they're actually due to take place, and I could be wrong, but until August, I think that's right. And what Trump did was at his Trumpy-est that was a one-man, completely unilateral promise. He didn't talk to anybody about that. And he also I love the entertaining facets of Trump's political rhetoric, and again, that's a show in itself. When he gets going with his somewhat rambling, repetitious rhetoric, especially when he goes off the cuff, he kept saying to reporters, as I saw him on the air, that these military maneuvers in South Korea are provocative. Plus, they cost so much money. He must have asked, I don't know whether he was serious or not, but he seemed to be asking seriously, who's paying for this? Well, we know who's paying for it.
We are.
But he seems to have reassured the folks in that part of the world, particularly South Korea and Japan, that we may not continue those maneuvers, thereby saving somebody some money and not upsetting the North Koreans, but we're not going to remove the troops. At least there's nothing that's been said of a serious nature about, and we're talking about maybe 30,000 troops, something like that. And we have a double whammy with the Chinese. I mean, not part of the big economic summit, but we face a evolving economic challenge with the Chinese. I mean, and talk about retaliation. If we up the ante and trade barriers and new tariffs and this, that, and the other, they certainly would not take kindly to that, and they've already thrown some things back at us.
Yes.
In the way of retaliation, clearly. And we need to consider that very, very carefully. But I think that, sure, they would love that. See, nobody's talking, but see, I can because I wasn't at the summit and nobody would dare bring this up. I'm not confident that Kim is not sitting someplace right now still contemplating the wonders of a reunited Korea. That's not going to happen. The Chinese and the North Koreans would certainly love, back to where we started a second ago, certainly love a less intrusive Western military presence in their part of the world. They would love that, and whatever they can do to negotiate that and make it happen, I'm sure they'd be much happier about that.
Well, we've gone the whole game here. We've gone from the G7 in Quebec, and we ended up in Singapore, and then we've talked about China and the peninsula of North and South Korea, and I hate to say this, but we're running out of time.
Well,
I really appreciate
thank you, Bob.
you coming in and voicing your opinion and giving your position. As we know, that any of my guests, as well as myself, is not reflective of the policies of Dixie State University, and these are indeed our opinions, and that's what makes this show go, is because we want the honesty and the well-thought-out opinions, adopted opinions expressed over the air, and that's why we're here.
Well, thus far, I'm sleeping moderately well as a result of the summit. Our president said that we should feel perfectly comfortable doing that, and I hope he's right.
Yeah, I saw the same headline. So, thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes this edition of Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions. Thank you very much for tuning in, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye. It's okay. We can edit out. You got to stop. You just came back. I'll get them. We're right on schedule.
All righty.
Right on.
That work okay?
Yeah, it worked perfect. It's still running. We're right on schedule. That was great. Thanks.
Okay.